Chapter 5. Only the sound of Twilight's breathing permeated through the thick darkness that enveloped her. This heavy breathing was Twilight's only comfort, as at the moment it was really the only way she could tell she was alive. While she felt some degree of safety since her pendant was remaining quiet, just like everything is in place. The silence was disconcerting enough that, in combination with the pitch-dark room she found herself in, she feared for her life just as much as if there was a monster getting ready to slice her in half. At that point, the one thing that the unicorn wanted most was to see again, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get the room to light up. Even though she knew she had the energy and was performing the light spell perfectly, she could even feel the light coming off her horn, yet the darkness around her remained. She concentrated harder, giving more energy to the spell. She knew the spell should have grown brighter, and yet no light penetrated the sea of black surrounding her. With an exasperated breath, she let the spell dissipate into the air and tried to absorb as much remaining unused magic back into her reservoir as possible. The strain from her chronic use of magic over the past few hours was starting to get to her, a testament to how dire her situation was concerning her natural magical power was much higher than the average unicorn's. Exhaustion was worse on her mind, as it always causing her thoughts to become clouded and problem-solving more difficult. The thought of losing her wits as well as dealing with diminished magical abilities terrified her. Losing free use of any spell might need was bad enough, as that ability was what had kept her alive so far. But to be deprived of both magic and intellect was all but a death sentence. Rather than fill herself with any more dread by pondering how her situation could deteriorate any further, she decided it was better to instead take stock of her situation was right then. She still had a tally of the items she had stored inside of her spell crafted, holding enough space right then, mostly notes and books that she was hoarding. She wasn't sure what was compelling her to hold on to them, but she felt those items were somehow necessary. She also had the health drink bottle from the library, though she was unsure of what it was used for. Would it be at the moment? Maintaining the storage spell was only a little taxing. The thing that had been using up the bulk of her magic was using her sword. She had been wielding the sword with her fear, gripping it harder than was necessary. She knew that that was a rookie mistake, an easy way to get you exhausted when you found yourself in prolonged danger. She could still remember practicing with her sword as a little filly. Hi-ya! Twilight cried out as swinging the wooden sword at the guard as hard as she could. Her weapon struck dirt as the guard simply stood to the side and levitated his own sword towards the filly before striking down against her head. Ow! The young student rubbed her head as the sword she had been gripping fell to the ground. That hurt! It hurt because you not only let your guard down, but you attacked at an inappropriate time, the unicorn explained as he returned the floating sword to his side. You are also gripping your sword too hard. You only need to grip it that hard unless when unleashing a devastating strike. I know that! The lavender filly huffed as she stood up, planting her hooves against the ground and pouring magic to her horn once more. The grip of her spell surrounded the small wooden sword they had provided her, and she again lifted it up to her side. That's too magic. You're gripping it as though you're trying to break it into splinters. The unicorn guard shook his head in disapproval. The little filly unicorn just huffed in annoyance once more and tried to reduce the grip of her spell. It seemed so much easier to just study magic as the prince's prized pupil. though she needed to be curious about practicing with swords. The guards she occasionally sparred with always complained about how she was doing it wrong. It was starting to annoy her. "Too little," the guard said, striking Twilight's sword with his own and knocking the wooden weapon from her grip. "You need to have just enough strength so that if you get struck, you won't lose grip of your own sword, but not enough to be so quickly exhausted by your magic." "When am I ever going to use this?" Ophelia stamped her hooves against the ground. Now she really regretted giving up precious study time for this silly hobby. "You're always going to use this," the unicorn guard explained, causing Twilight to glare at him with disbelief. "As the princess's student, you're tasked with learning as much about magic as you can, so you should already be aware of the fact that of how much magic you put into your spell affects how much the spell changes. Don't put enough magic into your spell and it doesn't work. Put too much and the reactions cause your spell to become something entirely different." The guard pointed out his wooden sword at Twilight. "Combat forces you to be aware of this at all times, to inactively channel your magic to just the right moment. Never too little, never too much. You may never have to raise your sword to a foe, and I pray to Celestia that day to where you have to never comes. But the fundamentals of what you are learning here will stay with you forever." The little Ophelia huffed angrily yet again. She was being lectured, and she knew it. Begrudgingly, she lit her horn up and grabbed her wooden sword once more. "Fine," she said while raising the sword. "But I only want to spar for a few more minutes. Then I want to return to my studies." "I have no objections." The unicorn nodded, preparing himself once more. Something loudly crashed into the darkness. Caught off guard in her own thoughts, Twilight screamed, fumbling over her own hooves to get away from whatever made that racket. Her leg struck something hard, and she tumbled forward. Her chin struck the ground, and she felt something wet splash against her face. She groaned as her chin ached. Her pendant began to flicker, light slowly filling the darkness that surrounded her. She sat up, rubbing her jaw, carefully of how she sat, with the burn still aching on the back of her legs and flank. She could feel the liquid that splashed onto her face. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light that was now flickering into the room. Twilight wasn't sure she was in the same place anymore. The interior decor she was beginning to see didn't look like anything she'd find in Rarity's boutique. She was even beginning to wish she wasn't seeing it at all, wanting the room to revert to the ruin it had been before. Rusted sheets of steel had taken the place of normal boutique walls, each spattered with blood as they come from gruesome occurrence had taken place next to them. The destroyed curtains were no longer made of the kind of cloth, but instead seemed to be made out of skin, stretched and torn in several places. The normal decorations of the boutique were replaced with rusted chains and grime. Twilight looked down at her legs and tried to avert her gaze from the horrific scenery and to also see what she had tripped over. It was the body of a creature in armor she'd killed before. The world had changed around her. The liquid she had landed in was its blood. She grimaced, feeling her stomach flip. She carefully stepped away from the body, not wanting to step in any more of the blood that had pooled out around it. She glanced around the boutique once more, looking for a rag or cloth she could wipe off the blood. But the only things that were anything remotely like a cloth were the skins hanging from the curtains, and wiping blood off them seemed just like nauseating as having the blood on her in the first place. She reached into her magic reservoir and pulled out one of the scrolls she had been keeping, the one with the nonsensical scribbles plastered all over it. She still couldn't discern any of the scribbles held anything important. For all she knew, it was there to block the original cryptic riddle. She gambled with the importance of the paper and closed her eyes. The scroll wasn't very absorbent and therefore wasn't able to pick up the blood that was spattered on her face very well, but she wiped as hard as she was able to get as much of the blood of possible off of her face. She knew she wasn't getting it all. She was certain there was some smudges left, but she felt better knowing most of it was off of her face. Twilight returned the now bloodied scroll to her magic reservoir while looking at the body she had just tripped over. She adjusted the light to look towards its head, spotting the angle of the sword that had still been buried deep within the monster. She grimaced quickly, realizing that it was going to have to be pulled out. She hesitated for a moment, but her horn lit with magic all the same. The handle was wrapped, giving her a good grip of the sword. She tugged on it, hoping it would slide out without much effort. But the sword barely moved, simply nudging to the side of her. Twilight grunted and pulled a little harder. The body was dragged along the ground by the handle of the sword. A realization struck her once again, flipping her stomach. The sword was stuck fast in the creature's body, and forcing it out would most likely mutilate it beyond recognition. She closed her eyes and collapsed a hoof over her mouth. Her stomach was rebelling and wanting to expel its contents. Her resolve was shaking. She was trying to remind herself why she needed that sword, the very same reason that it embedded in the creature in the first place. She needed it so that she could defend her life from the creatures that wished to snuff it out. She couldn't help her friends, the citizens of Ponyville, the princess, or Spike if she was dead. She gulped down the contents of her stomach and opened her eyes, wrapping a separate section of magic around the armored creature's head and neck. With a soft grunt, she pulled the two sections in opposite directions, feeling the objects catch on each other and refuse to budge. She grit her teeth and steadied her stance before lowering her horn and channeling more magic into it. The force made the sword begin to wobble, as though it was about to come out. The body oozed more blood from its mouth as it persisted in trying to retrieve her only weapon. A loud snap echoed through the dilapidated buildings as Twilight felt something give way. Her eyes widened as she lifted up the sword to the view. What had come free from the creature? Most of the blade had stayed embedded within the creature. Due to the age and wear and rust of the sword, she had picked up all that remained. Now it was a small, jagged stab of metal that used to be a sword. "Oh no!" Twilight felt her heart sink. Her sword had been the difference between life and death. Without it, she was certain she would. A shiver ran down her back, sticking her hair on end at the thought. She looked at the broken sword over carefully, noting how sharp and jagged the broken end was now. The blade only extended out about 3 inches now. The side still sharp, though admittedly a bit chipped. Twilight had a feeling that the jagged ends of the sword would likely snap off if too much pressure was applied to them, but that was still left as a means to defend herself. She would just have to use it as a dagger instead. As long as she didn't run into any more of those soldier-like weapon brandishing creatures, she could imagine she'd be able to defend herself. "I won't be able to kill anything swiftly, though," she spoke aloud to herself, slashing the impromptu dagger through the air. The length of the blade had been what allowed her to kill quickly so far, minimizing the chance of being hurt by any retaliatory attack. But now she'd have to stab until the creature she was fighting bled to death, not an option she liked. She vanished the dagger into her magic and took a deep breath, calming her senses. She opened her eyes back to the horrible world she now found herself in, able to smell the blood wafting through the air. She turned her head to where the front door had been, expecting to see splendid remains of where the creature had come in. Instead, she saw the same blood-splattered steel block the door. An idea sparked in her head as she examined where the door had been and remembered how her attacker had chopped the door into bits. She quickly looked around the floor, trying to find the double-headed axe that the soldier had been wielding. To her ever-growing luck, it seemed to have vanished. The body of the soldier was still there, but the weapon it had been using was gone. Twilight sighed in defeat. It seemed she wasn't going to be letting a replacement weapon that easily. The lavender unicorn then focused on her pendant and turned it to look around the room, trying to locate a possible exit. Her light fell upon a rather large wooden door located exactly where the 3 viewing mirrors had been replaced when she saw that shadow creature. She gulped, fear gripping her throat. She had a feeling that going through the door meant she was going to see that shadow figure again. The thought terrified her, but it was the only door that remained within Carousel Boutique, even if she hesitated to call it that anymore. Twilight hesitantly began to walk forward towards it. She stopped as heat tore through her haunches once more, biting her lip as the reminder of her burns struck her mind. During the tense moments when adrenaline and endorphins had been coursing through her blood, she had forgotten about how the pain assaulted the back of her legs. Not only was her offense capabilities reduced, but her ability to walk was hindered. She tried to push it to the side of her mind, stepping carefully so as not to agitate her hind legs as she walked up to the door that was now conspicuously in the middle of the building. She raised her hoof to the door, expecting it to be locked just as every other door she encountered and pushed against. The door let out a rusted squeal as it slowly swung open. Twilight was surprised as how heavy the door actually turned out to be, as it opened to reveal a stairwell that led down into a dark abyss. The unicorn was confused, not having expected there to be a basement of any sorts below Rarity's workshop, especially not one located in the middle of her showroom. Lavender Unicorn pushed the thoughts aside, trying to remind herself that wherever she wasn't at Rarity's place of business anymore. Rarity would gag and faint in the sight that had become of her workshop. Aiming the light of her pendant down the stairs, she began to make her way down the stone steps. The walls lining the stairwell looked to be made of strange cobblestone, which she thought she recognized, but just was quite unable to place a hoof on it. Each wall was covered with a dark green mold that seemed to be sliding downward, with blood spattered all over just like the room above. The bottom of the stairs came upon her quickly. Her hooves clopped against the dark stone floor below. She turned her eyes upon the wall in front of her and gasped, almost jumping back in surprise. There was a large mural depicting Nightmare Moon in threatening pose facing the pony viewing it. The visage of the Mare of Darkness loomed over, her eyes glaring white in armor covering her body as if the night twilight had confronted her. It took her a moment to realize the mural wasn't moving, that the Mare of Darkness wasn't actually standing before her at that very moment. Her eyes scanned the mural more carefully, noticing a strange outline digging into the picture. She traced the shape with her eyes and realized that there was a door the mural had been directly painted over. Twilight placed her hoof against the door and pushed. Nothing. The door didn't even so much as budge. She ran her hoof along it and felt it slip inward a little bit. She blinked and looked closer. Part of the mural was missing, specifically the chest piece of Nightmare Moon. The moon-adorned mantle she wore wasn't there, and in its place was an indication in the wall in the same shape. "This day just keeps getting weirder," she murmured softly, putting her hoof back on the ground. She turned her head to look around the hallway. The walls were still made up of the same stone material that the stairs had been made of, though there was a less grime on the particular rocks and more spatters of dry blood. The stench finally reached her nose, and she gagged softly, realizing she had already started to get used to the smell of blood in the air everywhere. The hallway was narrow, not what she had expected to find in a basement. The building materials didn't even seem similar to that of the boutique, as if they had been built first before the boutique had been put on top of it. The door before her was locked for now, and the hallway went down to her left and right, seeming the same in either direction. Taking a wild guess, Twilight began to walk down the right path. Her hoof struck the stone ground as she walked, the echoes bouncing off the walls loudly. The creeping darkness still sent an unsettling chill upon her spine. Anything could be lurking in the shadows, just waiting to attack her. The echo of her hoofsteps offered no comfort against the knowledge that her medallion could still go off at any moment. The hallway made a sharp turn to the left suddenly, causing Twilight to hesitate. She carefully peeked around the corner, illuminating the path before her with her pendant. She saw the hallway come to a dead end and another wooden door placed in the wall. She crept around the corner and walked up to the door. She placed her hoof against it and summoned the dagger-length sword to her side. She'd be ready for anything that lay in wait on the other side. At least, she hoped she would. The door creaked open. Her room remained silent as her light hit the room, but her eyesight instantly caught something wrong. Hanging from the ceiling were several blood-red vines with plant-like weeds matching the vines, snaking all along the ceiling. It was as if the ceiling itself was a plant. From the ends of the few of the vines she could see a dark red liquid dripping from the ground. She could only guess what it was exactly. The stone walls were covered in rusted chain links that seemed to be keeping the stones in place. The stone floor had several cracks that the liquid dripping from the ceiling seeped into. Twilight cautiously walked into the room and shut the door behind her. She couldn't see anything of particular interest towards the front of the room, but she couldn't just leave it unexplored. She carefully walked towards the center of the room, not knowing what to expect. A drop of liquid hit the top of her head as she shivered, feeling it on her body. She heard something shift in the room, and her medallion began to buzz. She instantly turned towards the source of the sound. There was an opening in the wall to her left that seemed to go into a separate section of the room. However, two things appeared to be in the way. The first was a stone altar that appeared to be missing 3 square indents on the top. Behind it was a gigantic creature that seemed to be stretched taut across the opening. It was bound by 2 large circles, one on the ceiling and one on the floor. Each circle covered a large protruding spike aimed for the creature. Its body was attached to the wall by large books, stretching its ragged skin taut. Twilight could see several muscles through rips in the skin, the creature dripping blood from the wounds. Its head appeared to be small, though Twilight could only assume it was a head. It seemed to have a mouth that opened slightly only for it to take in breath. Its lower half appeared to have been forcefully ripped off, though no entrails hung from below it. She couldn't discern what kind of creature it had been. It was unlike anything Twilight had ever seen before. She held her former sword out before her, waiting for the creature to attack. Her medallion was buzzing, telling her it was a threat. She wasn't about to be caught off guard by an attack from it. The creature only seemed to slightly move within its confines, the hooks digging into its flesh as it breathed and hanging flesh on the lower half of its body, brushing against the ground as it moved. It didn't even seem to make a sound, content to just stand in the designated spot blocking her path. She looked the creature over, trying to discern its purpose, but its only persisted in remaining still. Very cautiously, Twilight looked around the room. There was nothing else in there, only the monster and the altar before her. She looked back at the altar before the monster, making note of the 3 empty indents that it presented. So, I need to find the armor pieces of the mural, and I need to find 3 squares for this creature, she mentally noted, stepping away from the creature and back towards the door. The further she grew, the quieter her medallion became. Grabbing the door with her magic, she opened it and backed out slowly, closing it behind her. The medallion grew silent, prompting her to let out a sigh of relief. "They just can't make this easy on me," the Lavender Unicorn whispered to herself. She put the sword back into her reservoir and looked at the dead end of the hallway. "I guess that means the answer is the other way," she softly cursed herself for picking the wrong way. She passed the mural again and reached a sharp turn to her right, just as she had gone down the other hallway. The other hallway also led to a dead end and a wooden door, same as the other hallway. She placed her hoof against the door and opened it, peering inside with the light of her pendant. This room was just as different from the hallway as the last room had been. Instead of the grime-ridden stone, this room was adorned with brown stone tiles, as though the room belonged in one of Equestria's many discarded ruins. This room also had the telltale spatter of blood along the wall, but what stuck out most was the wall directly across the door. Twilight carefully walked up to it, not understanding what she was seeing. There were 3 separate sheets of glass, allowing her to look inside of the 3 boxes within the wall. Each box contained an environment, each one different from the other. The leftmost box contained a beautiful jungle, kept pristine within the glass. She could see luscious greens and beautiful flowers inside. A single tree seemed to dominate the back of the box, fill the ceiling with the bountiful branches. The middle box contained what seemed like a murky field, grass covering the floor but was dampened with water. Above the ground was a darkened black cloud that covered the entire ceiling, threatening to rain at any moment. The third window seemed to contain a bookshelf and a ladder. Each of the books seemed indistinguishable from one another, yet brimming in the knowledge at the same time. None of them had any dust, indicating they were well kept, but no one was there to read them. Twilight viewed the scenes curiously, not quite sure what they meant. Each one contained a theme, but what did the theme mean? She shook her head slowly, trying to take a mental note of the scenes before turning to look at the rest of the room. It contained nothing more than the scenes and another door. With nothing left to do in the room, the unicorn inspected the second door before opening it. "Huh?" Twilight wondered aloud while walking in. There was a strange contraption taking up the entirety of the room. It appeared to be a cage of some sort. Through the ceiling and the floor was made out of the same cobblestone from the hallway, and the bars on the sides only went down about 3/4 of the way before meeting a wall, as though it was a guardrail. The front of it had an open door, and inside the door she spotted a lever. The unicorn sparred a moment before stepping into the cage, unexpecting the door to have shut closed behind her. She turned to look at the lever, not sure what its placement with the cage accomplished. If it locked the cage, that meant she could flip the lever and escape once more. Taking a gamble, she raised her hoof and pulled the lever down. As she expected, the door to the cage closed in front of her. "What a silly contraption," Twilight muttered softly to herself, raising her hoof to flip the lever the other way, when the entire cage suddenly lurched. Twilight stumbled away from the door, trying to keep her balance as the entire cage began to move. The cage grew pitch black, save for the shining of her pendant. Twilight turned her attention to the walls that were moving upwards just beyond the steel bars. The entire thing was moving down, as though it was automated to. The unicorn was rendered speechless. Of all things she expected to happen, the cage taking her somewhere was not one she had even considered. With nothing to do to wait for it to stop moving, her mind quickly went over the layout of the boutique in her mind. She couldn't conceive such an intricate basement was resting underneath Ponyville, let alone the boutique of all places. She'd been feeling as though she was in some kind of unworldly place ever since she'd ever heard the droning of the siren. The cage lurched once more, almost knocking Twilight off her hooves. The entire contraption stopped moving, and the dim light began to filter into the cage once more. The door opened up, revealing the room before her. She carefully stepped out on the cage and viewed the rather large set of wooden double doors just before her. They looked as though they belonged in a castle. After walking up to the doors, she pressed her hooves against them and pushed. With a heavy creaking, the doors gave way, allowing her to access the room that lay beyond them. The hallway she entered was gigantic in comparison to the one she had been just through, easily large enough to be one of the hallways in Canterlot Castle. A moth-eaten red carpet stretched from the door across the entire hall. The grime and blood-soaked stones lined the walls and floor. She couldn't see the ceiling unless she aimed her pendant straight at it, and the large windows, which normally contained stained glass pictures, were instead covered with rusted, blood-spattered steel she had seen on the first floor of the boutique. Twilight's eyes were drawn to the center of the hallway, where a square marble pillar stood, holding a glass case on top of it. She spotted something inside of it was glinting off the light of her pendant. Twilight approached the marble pillar to see what was inside. The buzzing of her medallion froze her in place, however. She was instantly looking around for the sources of the sound. Her ears perked, hearing the sound of a stone being scraped by metal. She swirled around, looking for the shoulder she was expecting to see. The scraping metal continued. The buzzing of her medallion grew louder, and no matter where she looked, she couldn't spot the creature. Her heart began to race, her breathing going short as she felt herself slipping into a panic. She was right on top of a monster, and she couldn't see it. She could feel sweat forming on her forehead as she stepped back, bumping into a marble pillar.